Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from Beirut in Lebanon. We meet after the tragic demise at just 58 years old of Comandante Hugo Chavez, the commander of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, the man who transformed his country in 14 years in power with 4 presidential election victories, 3 great referenda triumphs. But the one thing he couldn't beat in the end was cancer. At the tragically early age of 58 and just literally days into his official term as President of the Republic for the 4th time, President Hugo Chavez is no more. And a new election will have to be held under the Venezuelan Constitution within 30 days. We'll be looking at Hugo Chavez's life in politics, what he did for his country, what he did for Latin America, what he meant to the Arabs and to those who are the enemies of the Arabs. We'll be looking at what comes next in Venezuela. We'll also be looking at what he achieved in the use of the revenues from the great bounty of oil which God gave his country. We'll be seeing just what good oil can do, and we'll be asking how come it hasn't done so much good in some other places. Kalima Horra means free word. We believe that every word has the right to be free. I'll be speaking freely, my truths, and my studio audience may have other truths that they wish to speak. In any case, they are welcome to speak their words freely, because that's what we believe in on this program. That's what we believe in at Al Mayadeen Television. The death of Hugo Chavez, aged, as I said, just 58, is a very big tragedy. I personally was a close friend and comrade of his. I am a soldier in the army, of which he is or was one of the most important leading officers. President Chavez and I were together with my wife and millions of others celebrating in Caracas just, it seems, a few weeks ago, last November, on the smashing victory that he achieved. 27 opposition parties combined to produce one opposition candidate, Capriles, supported by Israel, backed by American Zionist interests with millions of dollars. It was believed by the United States that this time they could bring Chavez down. We were there with Al Mayadeen, as it happens, for the best part of 2 weeks. We moved around the streets of Caracas. We watched Chavez up close and personal, a big, gregarious force of nature, a bear of a man who seemed to be unstoppable. And when the election came, the people in Venezuela came out in their millions, and it was noticeable what kind of people they were. Poor Venezuelans were out in their millions. Black Venezuelans were out in huge numbers. Disabled Venezuelans whose lives had been transformed by Chavez's reforms, so far as disabled people are concerned. Every disabled person in Venezuela had a personal carer. Everyone. A full-time, 24/7 personal carer. Every disabled person in Venezuela had an electric wheelchair and every facility that anyone could produce. Chavez, in his personality, was his country. He was part Spanish, part Native American, the so-called American Indians, and part black from a slave heritage. These 3 parts together in one man, Chavez, encompassing the 3 different strands of the Venezuelan society. He won a smashing victory, as I said. It was the biggest vote that he had ever achieved. And after 14 years in power, that's really saying something. Chavez's achievements are without comparison anywhere in the world. When he came to power 14 years ago, the vast majority of Venezuelans never shared at all in the great oil wealth of the country. 14 years later, illiteracy has been virtually eliminated in Venezuela. More than 40 new universities have been built in just 14 years. In fact, Venezuela has the 5th highest student population in the entire world, and there's only 29 million people in Venezuela. Go figure, do the maths. The social housing sector transformed the lives of ordinary Venezuelans, millions of whom lived in poor barrios, shacks on the sides of hillsides that were swept away every time the floods came, with thousands killed. Not only had most Venezuelans achieved a good house, Chavez's pledge in the last election last November was that by the end of this presidential term, if he had lived to preside over it, every Venezuelan would live in a dignified house. More than 90% of Venezuelans now eat 3 meals per day, and the other 10% eat at least 2 meals per day. This is not true in the United States of America, never mind in the rest of Latin America. So by all social indices, the human right to a job with a decent salary, with some security if you are out of work, the human right to a house, the human right to health care, which has been transformed during Chavez's revolution, with the Cuban health system sending doctors by the thousand, in fact by the tens of thousands, into Venezuela to transform the health conditions of the people. These are all human rights. I mention that because I have now been interviewed at least 10 times since the death of Chavez by British and United States of American media. And in every case, they wanted to talk to me about Chavez and human rights, as if the right to a job, a house, health care, education, social security were not human rights. In the course of the program, we'll be exploring these aspects. But I want to finish my introductory remarks on this. Chavez's ambitions were not just limited to Venezuela. He was interested in Latin American unity, in bringing together all the peoples of Latin America, just like some Arabs are interested in bringing together all the people of the Arab world. Chavez invested in a bank of the South, in a university of the South, even a television station of the South, Telesur. But his ambitions didn't finish there. When Israel attacked Lebanon in 2006, the first country in the world to expel its Israeli ambassador was Venezuela. And he never returned. And relations with Israel were broken as Lebanon was being broken by the Israeli Air Force. There are some Arab countries didn't even expel the Israeli ambassador for the crime they committed in 2006. Palestinian refugees were allowed entrance into Venezuela without a visa and were given citizenship of Venezuela if they wanted it. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs are living in Venezuela, and the vast majority of them, more than 90%, were voters and militants for President Hugo Chavez, because he stood up for the Arabs. He stood up against Israel. He stood up against America, which is the same thing. America pays for every Israeli crime. Chavez was against Israel and America. So what does his demise mean for the Arabs? And as I said, we'll be exploring over the course of this show. If Chavez managed to do all that in just 14 years with his oil money, how come all the oil producers can't do that over 40, 50 years with all their oil money? These are the subjects that I shall explore over the course of the evening. I salute Hugo Chavez, of course, but it's much more important to look forward now to what all this means for Venezuela, for Latin America, for relations between the United States and undeveloped countries to their south, and what it means for the Arab world that Hugo Chavez is no more. In the audience with me, I have experts and amateurs just like me, but they've all got a point of view, and I'm going to throw it open now to the audience. Who wants to make some reflections, first and foremost, on the death of Hugo Chavez? Yes, sir, in the front.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام.
هناك مصادر سياسية فنزويلية صرحت أن موت شافيز كان بتسمم وليس فقط بالسرطان، واتهمت الCIA في الموضوع، والتي اشتهرت باغتيال رموز سياسية عالمية وأمريكية بنفس الوقت. فما مدى صحة ذلك؟ وسؤال آخر، إذا كابريليس فاز في الانتخابات القادمة، ألا يعني أن هذا خسارة لفنزويلا في الموارد النفطية كما حصل للدول العربية كالعراق خلال الغزو الأمريكي؟
Well, you know, once upon a time I would have laughed at the idea that the CIA or someone else had killed Chavez. But I was a friend all of my life of President Yasser Arafat. And I saw him go from healthy to dying to dead so very quickly, and I now know that he was murdered. In Latin America, a whole range of leading figures have been struck down out of nowhere, it seemed, with cancer. President Fidel Castro was struck down with stomach cancer. President Kirchner in Argentina was killed by cancer. Chavez was stricken by cancer. The president of Bolivia has cancer. All these left-wing leaders, all these progressive leaders, plus Arafat, have all mysteriously contracted these killer illnesses. I have absolutely no evidence at all that what happened to Chavez was not a natural cause. If there is any evidence, I have no doubt that the Venezuelan people will reveal it. But I do think it's a particularly cruel coincidence that so many important figures in the progressive movement for liberation in Latin America and in the world have been struck down in this way. We'll see what comes out. President Arafat has been exhumed. They are doing the tests now on his remains. I hope it's not much longer before we get some results from those tests. Tests which, by the way, should have been done on his deathbed in Paris. And I was there in Paris arguing that he needed a post-mortem and that there should be proper studies done on his death. Capriles, well, I'm very clear about this. Israel is supporting him. They supported him last time. The Israel lobby in the United States has flooded him with support, including massive financial support, because they want to take Venezuela out of the camp of progress and liberation. They want to turn Venezuela from a country hostile to Israel to a country in the camp of Israel. That's another reason for praying that Nicolas Maduro, my friend, the former bus driver, who's running now for president of the Republic, it's another good reason to pray that he wins. Me, myself, I'll be going there to try and put my shoulder to the wheel to make sure that Chavez's legacy is not lost, and that if somebody did kill Chavez, they don't succeed in killing his ideals. I'll be back in just a moment with the second part. Don't go away. Welcome back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television. We're discussing the legacy of President Hugo Chavez. We're discussing the meaning of his death, and we're discussing what it means, amongst other things, for the Arabs in the future. I'm with the studio audience in Beirut, dazzling in its brilliance and its perspicacity. There's a good word. Try and translate that one. Yes, madam.
نهى إبراهيم لبنانية كوبية. كما قلت وكما نعلم تشافيز هو بدون منازع هو سيمون بوليفار هذا العصر، وهو الذي أجبر الحكومات اليمينية اللاتينية على أن تتضامن معه في البرامج التكاملية التنموية مثل الألبا والسلك. فسؤالي هو ما هو برأيك مستقبل هذه البرامج التي وضعها تشافيز من أجل في نضاله من أجل العدالة الاجتماعية والاستقلال، وأيضا الاستقلال والسيادة ضد طغاة السياسة الأمريكية؟ ما هو مستقبل الثورة البوليفارية؟ شكرا.
Well, first of all, let me salute Cuba, because if there had been no Cuban revolution, there would have been no Venezuelan revolution. If there was no Fidel Castro, there would have been no Hugo Chavez. And the struggle of the doctors and nurses and experts in Cuba to save the life of Chavez is something that has earned the undying gratitude of people around the world who are very sad at this demise. And we know that Chavez went to Cuba because the Cuban health service is the best in the whole world. And that's really saying something for a poor country in the Caribbean, and a great tribute to the Cuban people and their revolution. The answer to your question lies in the next 30 days. If Nicolas Maduro is elected as the new president of Venezuela, then the policies of Chavez will continue. Maduro is a very outstanding figure. Of course, he's not Hugo Chavez. There is not two Hugo Chavez in the whole world, never mind in Venezuela. It's a very difficult act to follow. But I'm confident that Maduro, whom, as I say, I knew him when he was driving a bus, and I hope to see him, God willing, as the president of the country, then the policies will be set, and ALBA and all the progressive developments which Chavez championed in Latin America will continue. But if the oligarchy returns to power, then we will see a return of Venezuela to its old role as a slave of the United States, like one or two other countries in Latin America still are, but most now are not. And the oligarchy will be back in charge. Schools, hospitals, social housing, the development of young people, poor and ordinary young people, will be abandoned, and the transfer of wealth which Chavez achieved from the tiny 1% to the 99% will be reversed. And the 1% have a lot of money, and they are going to throw a lot of money at Capriles' election campaign. So, of course, I'm going to pray, but I'm also going to go, just in case. Just in case. Who else would like to? Now, we've got a Cuban in the room. I think we've even got a Venezuelan in the room. I'm sure we'll come to her later. Yes, sir, go ahead.
مصطفى الديراني. كيف يتجسد موقف تشافيز السياسي مع العرب اتجاه العدو الصهيوني، وما هي الإجراءات التي قام بها لتأكيد موقفه؟
Chavez stood with the oppressed and against the oppressor everywhere. He was a follower of Comandante Che Guevara's great maxim that he who cannot tremble with indignation at any injustice anywhere is not a man. This was Chavez's creed. So it didn't matter to him that he'd never been in Lebanon. It didn't matter to him that he'd never been in Palestine. He knew which side he was on. He knew who was the oppressed and who was the oppressor. I'm speaking highly of him because I loved him. But you have to know that this is not an ordinary thing. Even amongst Arab leaders, maybe especially amongst Arab leaders, there has not been this commitment to the oppressed and against the oppressor. As I said in 2006 in a speech in Hyde Park in London, the real leader of the Arab world is President Hugo Chavez, and 100,000 people cheered because his expulsion of the Israeli ambassador was a dramatic act and which has never been repaired, and all relations with Israel were severed at that time. Whilst today there are still Arab countries who have diplomatic relations with Israel, who have Israeli embassies in their capital, who have the Mossad operating in their airports and in their capital city. Yes, sir, in the second row.
عمر مصلح. بس السؤال اللي حابب تعلق عليه او النقطة اللي حابب تعلق عليها هي موقف بعض المثقفين العربي اللي بيكتبوا بصحافة النفط والغاز، يلي من امبارح من لحظة صدور الخبر وفاة الكوماندانت الرفيق تشافيز بلشوا يكتبوا عن تشافيز انه كان ديكتاتوري وكان عسكري وكان شمولي. بس حابب تعليق على النقطة. وفي نقطة تانية هي نقطة المناضل الأممي إليزابيث سانجريس كارلوس اللي كان تشافيز ملحقها بشكل دائم وبشكل دوري. بس إذا فيني أعرف، لأن كنت بكاراكاس من فترة وقت الانتخابات، مصير هاي القضية لأن قضية مهمة جدا. شكرا.
Yes, thank you for that. Of course, I'm familiar with the, let's call them intellectuals, I don't like to, and their arguments. First of all, it is simply ludicrous to describe Chavez as a dictator. He's the most elected politician on the earth. And he won every one of these elections in the teeth of United States opposition, with the United States using all its financial and propaganda and other subversive means to defeat him. He triumphed every time. Even when they staged a military coup against him, it bounced back on them. It was a boomerang, which made Chavez more powerful. But they're still calling him a dictator. How many elections do you have to win before they stop calling you a dictator? So it's preposterous, this idea. They say that he closed opposition television stations. But you were there in Caracas during the election, so was I. The vast majority of television stations in Venezuela are in the hands of the opposition and spend all day and all night attacking Chavez and supporting Capriles. Only one station in Venezuela was pro-Chavez. All the other stations were against Chavez. So the idea that he cracked down on freedom of expression is absurd. I never was in a place where the cacophony of noise from the opposition was so great and in comparison with their electoral strength so puny. A bigger charge that they make is that by his alliances with, for example, Iran, that somehow he's betraying the liberal or progressive cause. I don't accept that either. Chavez didn't try to institute an Islamic republic in Venezuela. He was not a Muslim. His support for Iran against American subversion and threat of war by America and Israel had nothing to do with specific support for any or all of the policies of Ahmadinejad or anyone else. You have to know where you stand in this world. Are you with those who are threatened by the empire, or are you with the empire? That's the way I see things, at the very least. Let's take another contribution. Yes, sister, a Venezuelan, please.
Yes, Fatima Abu Nasif, born and raised in Venezuela. I have a two-part question, and they're clarification questions, actually. Given all the clear foreign stances by Capriles that you've been discussing, I find it kind of puzzling that we still see this wave of Arabs living in Venezuela who speak out against Chavez and his ideology. So I just wanted to ask about what's your take on this matter? Why would Arabs support Capriles, who is obviously pro-Israeli and backed by Israeli forces, over Chavez, who is more Arab than, I see it this way, he's more Arab than half of us all put together. So just a clarification question.
And your other questions were what? Because I'm going to answer you after the break.
And my other question is, I have friends in Venezuela who are part of this wave of youngsters who are against Chavez and who overshadow all of his accomplishments and all of his achievements upon this shi'ar that he was a dictator. So I just wanted to ask, what do you think is the main advantage, if there is any, or what is the main drive behind the campaign of the opposition who is leading these youngsters to just look over what Chavez really did for the country and go for someone else? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to deal with these questions in the next part of the show. The great majority of Arab voters, it's a psephological fact, in Venezuela voted for Chavez last time. But a substantial enough minority did not. They tended to be the very richest, who objected to Chavez's redistribution of wealth. He took money in tax, though less than the British government takes in tax, from rich people. And business people felt that he was not creating a pro-business environment, but rather a pro-people environment. I'm with that myself, but I'll further expand on it in the next part of the show. Don't go away. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, in Beirut on Al Mayadeen television. Kalima Horra, it means free word, and we believe that every word has the right to be free. Mine certainly are. And the studio audience also. We just heard from a young woman who is half Arab and half Venezuelan, and she had some very piercing questions. Namely, how can it be that any of the Arab Venezuelans support the pro-Israel, Israeli-backed opposition candidate against a man who's more Arab than the Arabs? Well, that young woman needs to spend more time in the Arab world. Because if you did, you'd know that there are lots of Arabs who are objectively on the side of Israel. And most of them are running countries and running governments in the Arab world. Such people suffer from the sin of placing their own personal interest, their own interest in their own wealth and their own position above anything else, above any religion or any patriotism or any humanity on the part of the others. And that's the truth about the very richest Arabs in Venezuela who were backing Capriles, a man who was the Israeli candidate in the election, against a man who did so much for the Palestinian cause and for the Arab world. It's true that politics, you know, it's a life and death matter, politics. You have a choice which is a zero-sum game. You have a pie or a cake, which is your oil wealth. You decide to give it to rich individuals or you decide to share it amongst the masses. There is no middle ground in that. And either you are with the giving it away to the small number, the 1%, or you are in favor of distributing it amongst the 99%. And for the 1% who were dancing, literally dancing in the streets of Miami, I don't know if you saw the pictures on American television, these people hope that Capriles will win the next election, that they will return to Venezuela and resume the old days when only the richest Venezuelans benefited from the oil wealth of the country rather than the mass of the people as a whole. I salute you. Good to see you here in Beirut. Let's take another contribution. Yes, sir.
Thank you. علي سميحة. كما تفضلتم أن موقف شافيز في العام 2006 من السفير الإسرائيلي ينبع حتما من علمه بمظلومية الشعب الفلسطيني والشعب اللبناني في الحرب آنذاك. برأيكم من هو الزعيم العربي في وقتنا الحالي أو القائد العربي الأقرب في مواقفه للقائد تشافيز؟ هذا هو الشق الأول من السؤال. أما الشق الثاني، فهل باعتقادكم أن أي دولة عربية تستطيع أن حذو فنزويلا في ميدان حقوق الإنسان والعدالة الاجتماعية ما لم تعتمد على قوانين مدنية بحتة وليس قوانين دينية؟ وفي حال نعم، من هي الدولة الأقرب إلى تحقيق ذلك؟ شكرا.
Well, you invite me on to thin ice, but I can never resist skating on thin ice. In the speech I told you about when I said in 2006 the real leader of the Arab world is Hugo Chavez, I also said the real leader of the Arabs is Said Hassan Nasrallah. And I mean that, and I meant it in 2006, and I mean it today. So if you're asking me which Arab leaders are fit to tie the laces on the shoes of Hugo Chavez, most of them are not. But Hassan Nasrallah is a great exception. And my friend Marwan Barghouti in an Israeli dungeon is another leader worthy of the name. But I'll not go further. I think you get my point. Your dichotomy between civil laws and religious laws is not one that I share. I think that if everybody believed or behaved according to the tenets of the religious laws of the books, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, the world would be a better place. So I'm not one who believes that religious laws are somehow inferior to man-made laws. I don't myself believe that. But you can only have religious laws if the people want them. You can't impose religious laws on people. Indeed, in the Quran, this is expressly forbidden, that there can be no compunction in religion. This is there in the Islamic religion. So, for example, when some extremist elements capture a small piece of Syria, for example, and declare what they call Sharia law there, this is illegitimate. They have no right to do that. First of all, they came from Chechnya or Libya or England to impose it. Secondly, the Syrian people as a whole have not accepted it. And thirdly, what is your interpretation of Sharia law? There is an Arab country this week is going to crucify and then shoot a group of thieves. Crucify on a cross, like Spartacus. Which part of Sharia law is this? Where does it mention the crucifixion of people who stole some gold, some jewelry, whilst there is Arab rulers who are stealing the whole country and who are crucifying small thieves, whilst they themselves are the biggest thieves of all? So if that's what you mean in relation to religious laws and civil laws, on that I'm with you. But people have the right to vote for an Islamic constitution, as the Egyptian people, for example, have done. And they have the right to have the constitution that they voted for. So it's not a black and white issue, I think. Who's next? Who's got the other microphone? Yes, sir, in the middle row.
Yes, good evening, sir.
Good evening.
David Zaited. We're used to Western media portraying leftist leaders and freedom fighters like Idi Amin, Castro, Gaddafi, Chavez, Bashar al-Assad, or even full regimes like Soviet Russia and China as persons evil and crazy. How do you think this influenced world opinion on great people such as Chavez? And do you personally think Maduro will be up for a similar fight with Western media?
For sure, and it will already have started. The attack on Maduro will be that he's not Chavez. It will be that, okay, Chavez was a pretty special guy, but now is the time to return to business as usual. That the Chavez period, it will be conceded, it's been conceded even in interviews with me by mainstream broadcasters in the West, okay, this Chavez was a pretty special guy, but now that he's gone, we'll get back to normal business. That's the thesis that will be mounted. Of course, those who control the means of information in the past were able to brand anybody in the way that they wished. But that was in the days when a small number of people controlled the means of information. Luckily, those days are gone forever. We have now the means to speak to each other. I myself have more than 30,000 videos on YouTube I have hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter and on Facebook. I don't need to go through anybody to talk to them or them to talk to me. And we have now many channels like Al Mayadeen, not many in the Arab world, it's true, but many across the world that are able to speak the truth to power and are not beholden to the oligarchy of Venezuela or the United States or Britain or anywhere else. I believe ultimately that good will triumph over evil, and therefore I believe that humanity will continue to go forward rather than backwards. But sometimes it will be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Who's next? Yes, sir. Please, at the front.
سنة 1992 قامت تشافيز بانقلاب عسكري، وكلنا بنعرف فشل بهذا الانقلاب. من بعد ما تسلم الحكم ديمقراطيا قام كمان انقلاب عسكري وأعلن عن استقالته ورجع بضغط شعبي على الحكم. هل ممكن اليوم بعد دفن القائد تشافيز نشهد انقلاب عسكري للاستيلاء على الحكم في فنزويلا؟ شكرا.
I don't think so, but you can never rule it out. There must be elements in the armed forces who are not necessarily loyal to the revolution. They may have remained loyal for a variety of reasons to Chavez, not least because of his military background as a paratrooper, as a tank commander. He was a man of real military bearing and power. So it may be that some difficulties emerge in the Venezuelan armed forces, but I doubt it. I was part, my wife was with me, we were part of millions of people in Caracas. The young man behind you who was there also can testify. Millions upon millions of people. It's amazing to be in such crowd with joy in their heart and singing their songs and flying their flags and their colors. This is a people that cannot be put back into a box. This is a genie, as we say, that cannot be put back into the bottle. And I believe that the Venezuelan revolution will continue and the masses will ensure that it does. Now, I've got time for one more before the next break. Who would like to make a contribution? Yes, the young woman at the back. Thank you.
Before he died, Chavez asked Venezuelans to vote for Maduro, but would he try to carry on Chavez's revolution and being an anti-American with all the pressure on him now?
Yes, actually, Maduro is, if anything, more militant than Chavez. He has a more orthodox socialist history than Chavez. So there is no question at all of Maduro's fidelity to the Bolivarian revolution. There is no question at all about his commitment to an anti-imperialist world view and view of support, giving all the support that Venezuela can give to the forces of liberation in the Americas and beyond in the world. The only question is whether now that this giant, apparently irresistible figure has fallen, a mighty oak tree has fallen in the forest, and its reverberations are still being felt throughout the world. The only question is whether a person who comes after such a gigantic figure can retain the support that's necessary to win elections when all the powerful forces in the world are trying to make you lose. This is the real issue here. Israel, the United States of America, even in President Obama's death statement, he was really speaking in code that now he wants to see political change in Venezuela. The US, Israel, the powerful forces of the oligarchy in Venezuela are all determined that Chavez will not be replaced by another Chavista. The question is, will the Venezuelan people allow them to sweep the gains of the revolution aside? We'll discuss that further after this. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television here in Beirut. We're talking about Hugo Chavez and the ramifications of his untimely death at the age of just 58 years. What will it mean for Venezuela, for Latin America, for international politics? What will it mean for the Arabs? And how come Chavez managed to transform his country and the lot of the majority in his country with their oil wealth, whilst others who've been lucky enough to have oil discovered under their land and their sea have apparently not been able so to do? We've got a very smart audience in Beirut this evening, so let's press on with their point of view. Yes, sir, in the middle row with the hat on. Yes, please.
Yusuf Haidar, you said that Chavez lasted for 14 years in leadership. Does that period of time remind you by other presidents who lasted for 10, 20, or 30 years? Second, what do you think will happen after Chavez's death in Venezuela first or worldwide?
Well, I don't think any president has been democratically elected for 20, 30 years. I think there have been presidents, many presidents, who have been in power for 30 years, some for 40 years. But that's not to say that democracy as is defined in my country, people talk about the mother of parliaments and Westminster democracy and so on, as if that was the only form of democracy. It's not. And being democratically elected is a necessary but not sufficient condition to claim that you are acting in a democratic way. If you manage to get elected democratically but act against the interests of the people, well, to what extent are you a Democrat? I think that Chavez would have served one more term, this term. I think that he would have been right then to hand over power. I think that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that it's not healthy for one man or one woman. My goodness, we had to suffer Margaret Thatcher for more than 10 years. Believe me, if you had lived through that nightmare as I did, the idea of her being in power for 20 or 30 years makes me shiver. But in general, I think that no one man, no one woman, no one family, no one regime should stay in power for ever. That's not healthy, I think, for any democratic system. Let me press on with some more from the audience who would like to contribute next. Yes, the young man at the front.
بعد موت القائد والرمز تشافيز يمكن أن يقوي خصومة تشافيز ومعارضيه في الانتخابات المقبلة. السؤال هو ما هي المصاعب التي يمكن أن تستجد في وجه استكمال الثورة التي قام بها القائد تشافيز؟
Well, there are real difficulties. The oil wealth of Venezuela is gigantic, but the needs of the people are considerable. After all, it's only in the last 14 years that the oil wealth has been used for social purposes and for the purposes of the masses. For decades before that, the state of underdevelopment amongst the masses in Venezuela was total. Until Chavez, for example, brought Cuban doctors into the poorest areas, barrios in Venezuela, they never had any doctor at all. And most of the poor masses in Venezuela could not read or write. They had no health care, they had no social housing, they had no social security, and they had very low wages. All of that has been changed in the last 14 years, but there's still a very great deal to do. Chavez pledged, for example, that by the end of this presidential term, every Venezuelan would live in a dignified home. This means that at this moment in time, not every Venezuelan lives in a dignified home. So the challenge of the new government, the new president of Venezuela, is still considerable. Not everyone in Venezuela is comfortable with their living standards, and not every one of them is satisfied with the lot that they have. There are people who will seek to exacerbate racial and ethnic differences in Venezuela, as was regularly done in the past. It is said that Chavez favored black people too much, that Chavez favored indigenous people too much. It's said that he spent too much on this and that and these sectors of the society. There are always people who seek to divide and rule, and such people will be out now in the pre-election period over the next 20 or so days, 25 or so days. The United States will do everything that it can to ensure the opposition candidate Capriles' victory. Israel will do everything that it can to ensure that victory. They will say that Chavez built a too powerful state and that private business interests should be left to run the country, that private business knows best. And there are some people who believe that, especially if they're private businessmen. And there are also some who falsely, I believe, identify their interests with private business of this kind. In fact, Venezuela is not a socialist country. Chavez was seeking to head in the direction of socialism, but the vast majority of enterprises in Venezuela are private. The vast majority of banks, of media houses and so on are private, and taxation is lower than it is in the United Kingdom. So the rich don't have actually all that much to complain about, but they will indeed complain. Let's take some more speakers. Yes, sir, at the front.
ما هي أبرز الإنجازات التي حققها القائد تشافيز وتميز بها على كافة الصعد الاقتصادية والاجتماعية بالنسبة للفنزويليين وبالنسبة للعالم ككل؟
I would say that of all his many achievements, the transformation of the lot of the poorest people has to be the greatest. When he came to power, poor people did not eat even 2 meals a day. Now, more than 90% of them eat 3 meals a day, and the remaining 10% of them eat 2 meals per day. Most Venezuelans, the majority, 14 years ago were lucky to eat 1 proper meal per day. This is an enormous transformation. For you and me who regularly eat, maybe we eat too much. This is not, it doesn't sound like such a big deal, but for a country of 29 millions now, it marks a complete transformation. Illiteracy was rife amongst the poorest of the people, especially the minorities in Venezuela, and in the last 14 years it has been virtually eradicated. But if I were to choose one of the achievements, it would be the education sector. To make Venezuela a country of 29 million, the 5th largest student population in the world, is truly phenomenal. If you think of the population of countries like China, India, Germany, Russia, Brazil, all these other huge countries, to have the 5th largest student body in the world is a truly remarkable thing. And Chavez built more than 40 universities in 14 years, which has to be a world record. All of Latin America does not have 1 satellite circulating the Earth. Venezuela has 2 satellites circulating the Earth. And we were there on the launch of the 2nd of those satellites, because it took place during the election period. The purpose of those satellites is not just for Telesur, the television of the South, which Chavez created, not just to help the TV business, but so as to directly, every Venezuelan child, forgive me, every Venezuelan child has a computer, every one. Every Venezuelan is given a laptop in school. And the purpose of the satellite is so that the children on their laptops, wherever they are, up a mountain, deep in a valley, in a slum barrio, or anywhere in Venezuela, that they can all benefit from satellite digital technology on a laptop which is given to them by the government. Chavez died young, but with a legacy like that, he'll never be forgotten, in my opinion. Now, yes, sir, in the middle, yes.
أنا عندي متأكد إنه فنزويلا حتضلها فنزويلا اسمها بوليفار وحتضلها حمراء، بس السؤال اللي بيعرف مادورو بيعرف خلفيته النقابية بيعرف إنه هو أكثر يسارية وأكثر راديكالية من تشافيز. هل ممكن هاي الشخصية تبعيد مادورو اللي هي أكثر تصلبا من تشافيز تودي ليصير في صراع بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبين فنزويلا؟ بحب أعرف رأيك بالموضوع.
Well, there has to be a danger of that because Chavez was such an iconic, such a totemic figure that in any confrontation or polarization with the U.S., Chavez was going to come out on top. When Chavez went to the rostrum at the United Nations the day after George W. Bush, he said, "Shaitan has been here. I can still smell the sulfur from yesterday." It's not easy to see Maduro following this policy because he's not Chavez. He will be quieter. He will be more serious in that way, more orthodox, as I said. And the question is, will this rally people in the way that people rallied to Chavez's flamboyance? I hope so. I believe so. But we have to wait and see and do what we can to help make sure. Yes, sir, in the front.
بحب أعقب على السؤال اللي قاله صديقي. إذا في حال مادورو كان بهيدي الجدية وكان بالقوة العسكرية اللي هو بيتسم فيها، هل ممكن تشكل صراع فعلا عسكري يعطي امريكا السبب انه تفوت على صراع عسكري، بما انه فنزويلا فيها بقلبها ثروه نفطيه كثير هائله مثل ما قلت، كما كان بالعراق نفس الشيء، وكان صدام حسين بيميز العراق بمستويات اميه كثير منخفضه، كمان ايضا القذافي بليبيا كمان نفس الشيء، وعطوا امتيازات لمواطنون بشكل كثير كبير، بس حوربوا اعلاميا وعسكريا، وبالنهاية غير أنه شالوا النظام وودوا البلدين لهلاك ولتقسيم طائفي واجتماعي كتير كبير، أيضا انسرق الثروات الموجودة بالوطن، وليبيا يعني حدث ولا حرج عن الثروات الموجودة بقلبها، وأيضا العراق بالموارد النفطية. هل تظن أيضا فنزويلا ممكن تتعرض لهذا الشيء؟
Well, I don't think, first of all, that we should compare Chavez with Gaddafi. I don't think this is a valid comparison. I don't think that Gaddafi belongs in the same league as Chavez. And I don't think he did with Libya's oil anything like Chavez did with the Venezuelan oil. I've been to Libya many times. I know how big a failure the former Libyan leadership was in the distribution to a tiny population, tiny, of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil wealth. I mean, there was only, I think, 3 or 4 million people in Libya. Every one of them should have been a multi-millionaire. And Libya should have looked like Dubai. But it didn't. And they're not. And that's a measure of Gaddafi's failure. Doesn't mean I supported the NATO attack on Libya, or the sectarianism and racism which is now rife in Libya, of course. But I don't like to ex post facto, because I was against the NATO, that means I have to be with the victim of the NATO. I'm not with Gaddafi. I was privileged to be a party to a conversation between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez on the question of socialism. Fidel argued, don't talk about socialism, just do socialist things. And this is a piece of advice fraternally I offer to Nicolas Maduro. We don't need to talk all the time about socialism this, socialism that. Just do good things. Just do the right things. And the people have a better possibility of supporting them. Well, the last section comes up right after this, so you don't want to go away, I promise. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television in Beirut, discussing the demise of Hugo Chavez, what it means for Venezuela, what it means for Latin America, what it means for the Arab world. How extraordinary it was that a president of a country in Latin America, speaking Spanish, with all the preoccupations of his own country and indeed his own subcontinent, should have been so interested and so committed to the Palestinian cause. For example, Hugo Chavez long ago declared that any Palestinian who wanted citizenship of Venezuela would have it. He allowed Palestinians to enter his country without a visa, while many Arab countries, maybe most, don't allow Palestinians to enter their country without a visa. He expelled the Israeli ambassador in protest at the brutal attack by Israel upon Lebanon, and he never allowed that Israeli ambassador to return, and relations remain severed between the two countries. President Chavez was deeply interested in the Arab world, and yet, as we've heard from a young Arab Venezuelan, there are some Arab Venezuelans who hated him and who supported the pro-Israel candidate, Capriles, who is now off and running again, hoping to be the next president of Venezuela. Some Arab regimes hated President Chavez. What could have been the reason for that? And was one of the reasons that everyone could see that if you're very lucky and God gives you lots of oil, you could do a lot with it to transform the lives of your own people, and that some other rulers cannot live up to the standard that he set in terms of the use of the oil wealth. All of that will be discussed in the last part of the show by my expert audience here in Beirut. Who's going to make the next contribution? Who's got the microphone? Yes, sir.
أنا شوي أكبر من معظم الحاضرين بين الجمهور، فبذكر تشافيز بال2002 أول مرة بسمع بتشافيز وقت اللي انعمل انقلاب عليه مدعوم من قبل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. بذكر أنه بمجرد ما كانت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ضد تشافيز أنا حددت موقفي معه بدون ما أعرف عنه شيء كتير. بعتقد هون لازم نشكر الولايات المتحدة لهيدا يعني لوجودها، لأنه مرات كتير بتسهل علينا تحديد الموقف. بعتقد بهديك الفترة كنت معتبر انه خلص مثل كتار من الزعماء ممكن يعبر عن موقف بيصير في انقلاب ضده وانتهت القصة، ولكن كانت المفاجأة انه الشعب الفنزويلي قدر يضغط ليستعيد تشافيز من الجزيرة اللي نفي عليها خلال 24 ساعة. اللي بدي اقوله انه هذا بيعطينا أمل أنه يكون الشعب الفنزويلي بنفس القدرة على الانتصار على غياب تشافيز، يعني بوقتها غيب تشافيز ل 24 ساعة واستعيد وفرض لمدة 12 سنة أخرى. وأعتقد أنه هذا بيعطينا أمل أنه ممكن يتم نفس الشيء الآن، أنه بانتخاب خليفة تشافيز اللي يقدر يحافظ على هذه المسيرة. المسألة الثانية اللي بدي أطرحها أو للنقاش مع حضرتكم إنه كذلك الأمر، يعني القضية أعتقد إنه هي اللي بتحدد قرب أو بعد أي شخص من العروبة. بعتقد إنه القضية العربية هي جزء من قضية تحرر عالمية، وبالتالي من يقترب منا بمعزل عن الجنسية وبمعزل عن اللغة بيكون عربي، ومن يبتعد عنا يكون غير عربي، بمقدار ما أنه اللي يقترب من قضايا الناس وقضايا الشعوب يكون عربي بمعزل عن جنسيته، ومن يبتعد عنا كذلك الأمر ممكن أنه يكون مولود عربيا ولكنه هو يصنف في الخانة الأخرى. هلا في شغلة حابب أطرحها، وقد تم يعني تحرمني الحصول على فيزا لزيارة الولايات المتحدة اللي ما راح أقدم لها بالأساس. إنه بنسمع عن زعماء ماتوا بأمراض بالسرطان. طبعا في زعماء أطيح بهم مثل ألاندي مثلا قتلوا مثل جيفارا، ولكن في زعماء تم تسميم، تم قتل عبر مرض قد يكون السرطان هو آخر موضة. متى يمكن أن نرى أو نسمع عن رئيس أمريكي مات بالسرطان سببته دولة أخرى؟ وشكرا.
Well, the United States had a president who was assassinated, indeed more than one. And John F. Kennedy was assassinated by his own countrymen, maybe even people within his own government service, maybe with the involvement of Hoover's FBI, maybe with the involvement of the CIA, maybe with the involvement of the military top brass who were furious at his refusal to declare all-out war against Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, or to begin a world war with the then Soviet Union in the Cuban missile crisis. So maybe we need a separate program to investigate these conspiracy theories. I said at the beginning, and I meant it, only a few years ago I would have laughed at the idea that such cancers were not just very bad luck and God's will and so on. But after my experience with Arafat, whom I knew like my father, I was unbelievably close to him from here in Beirut in 1977, and I was there at his bedside in the hospital in Paris when he died. And I saw him disappear in front of my eyes physically over just a few weeks. And I believed absolutely from the moment he got on the helicopter in Ramallah to eventually land in Paris, I was certain that Israel had murdered him, and of course suspicious as to how they managed to murder him. How was that possible, that they could reach him? In his words, he told his comrades, I think they reached me. How did they reach him? This was a big question for me right from the beginning. And so I don't laugh anymore at the prospect that Chavez was treated to the same polonium breakfast as Arafat was. It is possible, and time, of course, will tell. But I have no evidence of it, and one can only speculate on the circumstantial evidence. The big question for me is how Chavez was able to transform his country with his oil wealth, and other oil-rich countries are not able to transform theirs. Indeed, instead of trying to transform theirs, put it in banks in Britain and the United States, or invest it in casinos, not in owning them, in gambling on them in Britain and the United States and so on. This is a question I'd be asking myself if I belonged to an oil-rich country. As a matter of fact, Britain was briefly oil-rich, but we were poorer when the oil finished than we were before we found it. Who wants to contribute? Who's got the microphone now? Yes, sir, please.
First of all, أول شيء يمكن آكل قتلة بعد اللي حأحكيه. بس أنا ابن مدرسة أنا أستاذ بالسياسة حدا اسمه جوزيف سماحة. جوزيف سماحة لما عمل افتتاحية جريدة الأخبار ب 2006 قبل 2006 قال وين ما بتكون أمريكا أنا بكون ضدها، وأنا وين ما بتكون أمريكا أنا بكون ضدها. هاي مش مختلف معه. بس أنا قلت أنا بقول الرفيق أوكو جافاز، الكومندانت القائد أوكو جافاز. أنا بؤمن بأوكو جافاز لأن أوكو جافاز بيمثل كل القيم اللي أنا بؤمن فيها، بغض النظر عن رأيه اللي عمله بال 2006 او بحرب غزه لما صار العدوان علينا. انا اؤمن بهوغو تشافيز لانه لما تشافيز اجى يعمل نهضه بفنزويلا ما استعان لا بصندوق النقد الدولي وما استعان بالبنك الدولي وما استعان بحدا. لما هوغو تشافيز كان بده يعمل النهضه بفنزويلا احياء الصفيحي لفنزويلا ما شالها وعمل محلها اوتيلات 5 نجوم ومطاعم فاست فود. لما هوغو تشافيز صار بده اجى يعمل نهضه بفنزويلا خلى النهضه تنبع من عند الفقراء والفلاحين والمعترين والكادحين بقلب فنزويلا. هوغو تشافيز بيمثل لإلي زي شيء لازم نحن نتعلمه. هوغو تشافيز ما بعرف يمكن الفريز مش عم بيساعدني يلي لاقي القط فيه. هوغو تشافيز بيمثل لإلي شو مش بس انا هوغو تشافيز بالنسبه لإلي هو قضيه، لانه هوغو تشافيز اللي عمله مش بس كان مع فلسطين. هوغو تشافيز قبل ما يكون مع فلسطين انا بحبه، هو رمز لإلي لانه كان مع الفقراء ومع الكادحين اللي هن بقلب فنزويلا. ها هي بس حبيت اطرح الموضوع.
Let me just ask you, do you think the mass of the Arab people know of Chavez's relationship to the Palestinian issue? Do the mass of the Arabs know that Chavez stood up for the Arabs better than most of the leaders of the Arab countries? Do they know it? Because I met two young people before this program. They asked me, what's the program on tonight? They are students here. They asked me, what's this program on tonight? I said, it's about the death of Chavez. The boy looked blank.
Surely.
What is Chavez? Who is Chavez? Told them, Chavez, the president of Venezuela, he died. He still looked blank. I told him, you know Chavez, the one who supported the Palestinians, who supported Lebanon when it was being bombed by Israel, he still looked blank. And he's a student. Yeah?
اوكي اكيد في اشخاص ما بيعرفوا لتشافيز وفي اشخاص بيكرهوا لهوغو تشافيز لانه ما في اشخاص بيدعوا انه عرب، هن اكيد مش عرب، هن مستعربين. في اشخاص بيكرهوا لتشافيز لانه كان مع فلسطين، لانه كان مع المقاومه بالتاكيد. بس انا قصدي يلي كنت بدي اوصل له انه نحن لازم ناخذ هوغو تشافيز وندرس التجربه تبعيت هوغو تشافيز باللي عملها، لانه نحن بنعرف خاصه نحن بلبنان هون يعني بعد الحرب الاهليه اللي صارت حاولوا يعملوا إعادة إعمار. إعادة إعمار كانت إنه بيروت اللي نحن كنا نعرفها، اللي نحن كنا نشوف صورها، راحت ونعمل محلها بيروت مش لنا، بيروت للخليجيين، بيروت القهوة فيها ب $25، بيروت مش لنا. هوغو تشافيز لما عمل نهضة ما عملها بهالطريقة، عمل نهضة نابعة من عند الفقراء والعمال والكادحين. هذا اللي كنت قصدي أقوله. يعني أنا مع هوغو تشافيز مش لأنه بس مع فلسطين، أكيد مع فلسطين شيء كتير مهم، بس لأنه كان مع الفنزويليين.
ما شاء الله. I thought I loved Hugo Chavez. You love him more than me even. Who else? Someone who has not spoken preferably, but yes.
بعتقد انه كانت ازمة كتير من زعماء العالم الثالث او زعماء حركات التحرر هي عدم التواصل فيما بينهم. الى اي حد هلا في امكانية ليطرح او باعتقادك ممكن يطرح هكذا موضوع بين زعماء بيشبهوا تشافيز لا يقدروا يتكاتفوا في مواجهة الولايات المتحدة وفي مواجهة الإمبريالية بشكل عام؟
Well, I think first and foremost you have to have the will. You have to want to. You have to want to refuse to surrender to the hegemony of the North American superstate or the neoliberal economics or neocon foreign policies. You have to want to. Then you have to have the ability to convince your countrymen and women to support you in resisting that. You have to have the ideas of other ways other than going cap in hand to the IMF and the World Bank to ask for peanuts that your own brothers could have given you in any case if they weren't spending it elsewhere. You have to want to. You have to be able to persuade people to support you too. The people have got to believe in you. Chavez has died with no money in his pockets, like Gamal Abdel Nasser before him. Chavez didn't steal from his country. He didn't make his family rich. His soldiers' pay and his president's pay is the only wealth in the possession of Hugo Chavez, his widow, and his children. So you have to be clean. The people have to believe in you. You have to have ideas that are different from the prevailing orthodoxy of surrender to American domination and their economic and political system. If you do, Chavez proved you can move millions. Before Chavez, there were not millions of poor and black and minority and disabled and working people ready to march on the streets for a new kind of society. But Chavez's leadership gave them the opportunity to come together and to win. And they won. And over and over and over again. Venezuelan people have lost a great leader. And I remember him and will remember him always. But the future moves on. Hasta siempre, Comandante Hugo Chavez. Presente.